Imagine stepping into a stylish, bustling restaurant that exudes warmth and sophistication, only to sense a lurking tension beneath its polished facade. That's exactly what Dwayne Johnson faces the moment he quietly walks in, the savory aroma of sizzling steak colliding with an unmistakable undercurrent of unease. In the shadows of this seemingly perfect eatery, secrets stir and hidden agendas simmer, ready to boil over at any moment. A sob from the back corridor shatters the illusion, foreshadowing a night in which loyalty, courage, and raw human desperation come crashing together. Will Dwayne uncover the dangerous power plays taking shape right under his nose? Or will he become their unwitting pawn? Stick around for this pulse-pounding tale that proves appearances can be deceiving. And remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss a single thrilling chapter. Dwayne Johnson stepped quietly through the side entrance of Verano, a Los Angeles eatery that he, years ago, had painstakingly developed from a simple dream into one of the city's more upscale yet welcoming culinary establishments. It was never intended to be a celebrity vanity project or a mere afterthought to burn money. Dwayne had poured countless hours into crafting the restaurant's concept, hand-picking talented chefs, and designing a menu that could bring together people of all walks of life. From the young couple looking for a special anniversary dinner to the seasoned Hollywood star who wanted a low-profile spot to relax, Verano was supposed to feel like a second home. On paper, everything about Verano shone brightly. Strong revenue streams, glowing online reviews, and a steady buzz of word-of-mouth recommendations. But if there was one thing Dwayne had learned through his experiences, both in show business and in running multiple ventures, it was that numbers did not always tell the full story. The deeper truth of any organization lurked not in spreadsheets, but in the conversations that took place in the back corridors, in the anxieties that staff whispered among themselves, and in the nuanced expressions on employees' faces after the dinner rush. Thus, Dwayne had developed a habit that he repeated every few months. He would visit Verano unannounced, wearing simple clothes, just a hooded sweatshirt and jeans, and slip into the dining area like any other patron. Some might mistake it for a stroll or a whim, but to him it was an essential pulse check. Tonight, the restaurant was vibrant with the energy of a bustling Friday evening. The air carried the savory scent of sizzling steaks and buttery garlic sauce, mingling with the muted hum of conversation among diners who were seated in plush booths and along a marble-topped bar. Servers hustled between tables, balancing trays laden with grilled seafood, seasonal salads, and meticulously crafted cocktails that gleamed in the restaurant's warm lighting. Amidst the lively crowd, a tall, meticulously dressed man stood near the edge of the main dining area, quietly observing every detail with a gaze that felt more predatory than reassuring. Dwayne recognized him immediately. Donovan Clark, the restaurant's manager. He was, in theory, responsible for maintaining high standards and ensuring that staff were performing at their best. But something about Donovan's presence tonight gnawed at Dwayne's instincts. The manager's stance was too rigid, his eyes too possessive of the space, suggesting that his oversight might be driven by more than just managerial diligence. Still, Dwayne was uncertain if this unease was simply the wariness of an owner, used to reading subtle cues, or if something truly problematic was afoot. Stepping away from the main entry, Dwayne drifted toward the bar, nodding politely at a few staff members who recognized him but wisely kept their distance, likely suspecting that his low-key presence meant he was there to watch and listen more than to dine. He had always insisted that employees treat him like a normal guest during these surprise visits. No special greetings, no fuss, no orchestrated displays of top-notch service that would mask everyday realities. On the surface, everything felt as it typically did, a flurry of busy servers, cheerful chatter, and guests enjoying their night out. Yet an unsettling feeling lingered in Dwayne's chest. That intuitive pang soon sharpened when, as he passed a side hallway near the kitchen, he heard a muffled sound that could only be described as quiet sobbing. Honing in on that sound, Dwayne slowed his pace. The hallway was dimly lit, a space often overlooked by customers who remained in the well-lit main area. As he moved closer, the low, emotional noise solidified into the unmistakable sound of a person weeping. Soft, stifled cries that suggested desperation rather than mere frustration. Through the thin gap of a partially open door, Leading to a small break room, he caught a glimpse of two figures. One was a young woman, her shoulders quaking under the force of suppressed tears, her hands locked around the cold metallic edge of a counter, as though it were the only thing keeping her upright. A young man stood beside her, his body angled protectively, speaking to her in urgent, hushed tones. Though Dwayne couldn't yet make out their names, a quick glance at their uniforms confirmed they were both Verano employees. Something in the woman's posture, in the way she kept her head bowed, struck him as more than just a bad shift or a single unpleasant encounter with a rude customer. Over his years in entertainment and business management, Dwayne had become adept at reading body language, and what he saw in that break room screamed of a deeper, more distressing problem. Not wishing to intrude too suddenly, he paused just outside the door. From inside, he heard the young man murmur, "You can't just let him do this. It's not right. He doesn't own you." The words were soft but fervent, laced with concern and anger all at once. The woman's voice, between sobs, struggled to remain calm. "But what choice do I have?" she whispered. "He made it clear that if I don't do what he says, I'm out of a job." The finality of her tone, the hopelessness it implied, made Dwayne's stomach twist. This was not the typical stress that came from dealing with demanding customers or the exhaustion of double shifts. It was fear, pure and simple, a fear that seemed to be rooted in the knowledge that her future, her livelihood, might be controlled by someone willing to exploit her vulnerability. Dwayne eased away from the door, deciding not to barge in just yet. He wanted to gather more context before confronting anyone. His first instinct was to ensure the employee's well-being, but he recognized that an overt display of authority, especially as the restaurant's owner, might cause her to retreat. Instead, he made his way back to the bar, slipping onto one of the sleek stools. While the bartender, a friendly fellow named Jacob, placed a glass of water in front of him, Dwayne's mind spun. Who was intimidating the young woman to such a degree? And how had such a toxic situation managed to emerge, or worse, flourish, within the walls of Verano without him knowing? He scanned the restaurant discreetly, his gaze eventually landing on Donovan Clark, who remained perched at the periphery, arms crossed and brow furrowed. The manager's eagle-eyed watch over the floor, combined with the conversation Dwayne had overheard, sparked a haunting suspicion that Clark might be at the center of this trouble. Dwayne had implemented thorough screening procedures when hiring managerial staff, but a polished resume and well-rehearsed interviews could easily hide manipulative behavior and malicious intentions. Resting his hand on the cold glass, Dwayne considered his next moves. Talk to the crying employee or her friend directly, or try to glean information from someone else who might be less rattled. As if prompted by fate, the same young man from the break room emerged into the bustling dining area, clutching a stack of plates. His jaw was tense and his hands jittered slightly as he tried to steady them. This, Dwayne thought, was likely his best opportunity to gain insight without causing a stir. And so, with the practiced ease of someone who had spent a lifetime navigating unpredictable scenarios, Dwayne slipped off the bar stool and made his way toward the server station, preparing to quietly uncover the truth. At the server station in the rear of the dining area, the young man set down the plates, exhaled sharply, and tried to calm the trembling in his hands. Dwayne stepped closer, careful to adopt a warm, unthreatening posture. Up close, he could read the name tag pinned to the server's uniform. Andrew. "Hey," Dwayne said in a calm voice. "Think I could borrow a pen? Mine seems to have disappeared." Andrew's eyes flicked up in surprise, then down again to the pockets of his apron. "Yeah, sure," he replied softly, handing over a simple ballpoint pen. The tension in his posture, however, remained. Dwayne lingered, not moving away. He pretended to study the pen for a moment, then let his gaze drift to Andrew's face. "I couldn't help noticing," Dwayne murmured, keeping his tone gentle. "You seemed worried about your friend back there. Is she all right?" Andrew swallowed, his grip on a stack of napkins tightening as he carefully avoided eye contact. "She's fine," he said, too quickly for the response to sound even remotely sincere. Dwayne tilted his head, speaking in a low tone to avoid drawing attention from nearby guests. "I can see she's not," he countered gently. Andrew's posture sagged, and he glanced over his shoulder toward the main dining room where Donovan Clark stood scanning the crowd. It was evident that Andrew feared being overheard. After a moment, he leaned in slightly and whispered, "She's not okay. She's really not okay." His voice wavered as though he was debating whether to say more. Dwayne nodded, encouraging him without pushing too hard. "Is it a customer issue?" he asked, well aware that the overheard conversation indicated something far worse. Andrew's silence stretched for several seconds before he answered. "No," he murmured, eyes flicking nervously in Clark's direction. "It's not the customers. It's something else." He didn't finish, but the implication was loud and clear. Before Andrew could elaborate, Clark, like a predator sensing threat, began striding toward them, his polished shoes tapping against the wooden floor with deliberate precision. The energy shifted palpably, and Andrew stepped back, his gaze dropping to the plates once more. "Everything okay here?" Clark asked, his voice a touch too smooth, as if he was forcing a veneer of politeness over something sharper. Andrew immediately busied himself with the plates, eyes locked on his work. "Just helping a customer, sir," he mumbled, averting his eyes. Dwayne turned to face Clark for the first time that evening, meeting the manager's stare with an equally steady gaze. Clark was in his mid-40s, neatly groomed, with the kind of self-assured, rigid posture that often characterized people who crave control. His expression revealed nothing but the faintest hint of suspicion. "Can I help you with something, sir?" Clark asked, layering extra emphasis on the final word, as though reminding Dwayne of his place as a mere customer. For a heartbeat, Dwayne contemplated revealing his identity then and there. But he decided against it. The moment wasn't right. Instead, he offered a nonchalant shrug and gestured with the pen. "I just needed to jot something down, and Andrew here was kind enough to lend me a pen," he said, keeping his tone neutral. Clark's lips curved into a thin smile that failed to reach his eyes. "Good," he replied, patting Andrew's shoulder in a gesture that was oddly forceful. "Let's stay focused on work." The tension in Andrew's posture visibly increased. As Clark strolled away, obviously still monitoring them from the corner of his eye, Dwayne returned the pen to Andrew and offered him a brief, understanding nod. Without speaking aloud, he conveyed that he wouldn't push further now, but intended to help. Andrew's gratitude was evident in his eyes, mixed with a flicker of dread, as if he couldn't be sure Dwayne's intervention would do more good than harm. But for Dwayne, the path ahead was becoming clearer. Retreating from the server station, Dwayne found that his chest felt uncomfortably tight. This place, which was supposed to be a haven of culinary delights and good cheer, now felt fraught with tension and unease. Verano had become a place where fear could spread unchecked, unless he took action. He decided to take a moment outside, stepping through one of the side doors into the crisp night air. The hum of the city surrounded him, distant car engines merging with the chatter of passers-by. To anyone watching, he might have looked like any restaurant customer stepping out to check messages, but inside his head, countless questions collided, each demanding resolution. Something about Clark was undeniably predatory. Dwayne had no shortage of stories about toxic leadership. He dealt with controlling personalities in the film industry and beyond. Yet it was different when it was happening under his own roof. He had personally vetted the managerial staff, or so he thought. Had Clark cultivated this oppressive environment so subtly that none of the higher-ups caught wind of it? Or had signs been ignored for the sake of maintaining a facade of smooth operations and healthy profit margins? Leaning against the exterior wall, Dwayne gathered himself, resolved that he needed more information. Merely suspecting wrongdoing or hearing whispered accusations wouldn't be enough to dismantle the stranglehold Clark had on these employees. He needed first-hand testimonies, and he needed to ensure that anyone who spoke up would be protected. If he acted prematurely, Clark could retaliate against the staff, particularly the young woman in the break room or Andrew, and that outcome was unacceptable. While he weighed his options, the side door clicked open again, and another staff member stepped out for a brief respite. This time, it was a sandy-haired bartender with a slightly weary expression. Jacob, the same bartender who had handed Dwayne a glass of water earlier. Jacob recognized him, giving a polite nod, but as he moved to check his phone, Dwayne seized the moment. "Busy night?" Dwayne asked, trying to sound casual. Jacob let out a soft chuckle. Yeah, Fridays at Verano are always wild, he replied, before hesitating. You, finding everything okay? His professional courtesy hinted at wanting to ensure a patron's happiness, but the question felt incomplete, like he suspected Dwayne might have another agenda. Dwayne nodded, leaning more comfortably against the wall. I wanted to ask you something about your manager, Clark. How's he to work with? Jacob's expression flickered with apprehension. He lowered his phone, his eyes darting around to make sure nobody else was within earshot. He's strict, Jacob said, measuring his words. He likes things done a certain way, that's for sure. Dwayne pressed gently. And is that normal for a manager? Jacob inhaled deeply, then exhaled, as if deciding whether to confide in him. Not like this, he admitted, lowering his voice. Clark's not just strict, he's… Jacob fumbled for the right word, finally settling on controlling, ruthless even, if you're on his bad side. Dwayne's jaw tensed as he absorbed Jacob's description, the puzzle pieces sliding into place with each new detail. He recalled Andrew's wary glance, the young woman's desperate tears, and now Jacob's fear-laden critique. You mentioned he can be ruthless. Anything in particular stand out? Dwayne pressed, careful to keep his voice calm, despite the simmering anger he felt toward Clark. Jacob paused, clearly debating how much to reveal. Finally, he spoke, almost in a whisper. There's Sophie. She's a server who's been here about a year. Clark keeps her late, sometimes when nobody else is around. And Jacob hesitated again, wringing his hands. He talks to her in a way that suggests she owes him something, like a favor or a debt she can't repay. I don't know everything, but I see how she flinches whenever he calls her into his office. It's messed up. Those words hit Dwayne like a punch to the gut. Sophie, he thought. Must be the woman he had seen crying in the break room, the one Andrew had been trying to console. He pictured her trembling hands gripping that metal counter, tears dampening her cheeks, while Clark presumably lurked somewhere in the building, like a specter. Dwayne had witnessed similar dynamics in other industries, powerful men exploiting those who were financially or emotionally vulnerable. But seeing it manifest here, in the restaurant he prided himself on, was intolerable. Has she ever said anything about it? Dwayne asked. Jacob shook his head. Not directly to me, but you can see it in her eyes. She's terrified. And who can blame her? She needs the job. Most of us do. The bartender took a cautious step closer, lowering his voice even further. It's not like it's just about working a few extra hours. Clark manipulates people, corners them. He's a master at psychological stuff, making you feel like there's no alternative but to do what he says. A heavy silence settled between them, punctured only by the distant hum of traffic. Dwayne gave Jacob's shoulder a reassuring squeeze. Thank you for telling me, he said, mindful of the risk Jacob was taking by speaking out. I promise you, I'm going to handle this. Jacob offered a small, tense smile, relief and anxiety mingling in his eyes. Just be careful, okay? He murmured, before heading back inside to resume his shift. Dwayne lingered in the alley, heart pounding as he stared at the stars overhead. He was used to high-stakes environments and had dealt with no shortage of questionable characters in his career. Yet this felt profoundly more personal. People were being victimized within his own enterprise, under his own brand. He could almost feel a swirl of guilt as he realized how little he truly knew about the day-to-day power struggles at Verano. It wasn't enough to show up occasionally or check the ledger. Stepping away from the building, he made a quick phone call to a trusted contact in Verano's corporate infrastructure, a friend in human resources. But even as he waited for the line to connect, he realized that the safest path for Sophie and others might involve confronting Clark directly, catching him off guard while the evidence was fresh and the employees were still on site. He hung up before the call went through, deciding to trust his own instincts. Immediately, he re-entered Verano, squaring his shoulders as he walked. The place was starting to wind down from its hectic dinner rush, but Donovan Clark was still there, perched near the server stations like a guard dog. The dining room's energy had shifted to a more subdued rhythm. A handful of customers were lingering over desserts and coffee, while others settled their tabs. Servers moved more leisurely, though a palpable undercurrent of tension remained. Dwayne scanned the room until he caught sight of Sophie. She was in the middle of a stilted conversation with a patron, her voice carrying the forced politeness typical of someone who was just trying to get through the shift. Her face showed no trace of the tears from earlier, but the hollowness in her eyes suggested she was merely going through the motions. Dwayne approached quietly. "Excuse me," he said in a tone meant to be heard by Sophie and the guest she was serving. "I need to speak with you for a moment." Sophie blinked, uncertainty flitting across her features. "I'm with a customer right now, sir," she replied. The patron, a middle-aged woman, sipping a delicate cocktail, gave Dwayne a sharp glance. "She's helping me," the customer snapped as though offended by the interruption. Dwayne kept his gaze locked on Sophie. "It's important," he told her softly, infusing his words with a seriousness that transcended mere customer inquiry. Sophie swallowed hard, torn between her duty to the patron and the unspoken urgency she sensed in Dwayne. "I'll be right back," she finally said, offering an apology to the irritable customer as she stepped away from the table. Almost instantly, Dwayne felt a wave of hostility emanating from Donovan Clark, who had noticed the interaction and was already edging closer. Sophie led Dwayne to a quieter corner, near a set of shelves that housed spare linens. There, away from the main thoroughfare, she fidgeted with the edge of her apron. Her eyes flitted up to meet his, and in them Dwayne read both dread and a faint flicker of hope. He kept his voice low. "I know what you've been going through," he said gently. "Andrew and others are worried about you. You don't have to say anything if you're not comfortable, but I want you to know I'm here to help." Sophie seemed to freeze for a moment, the corners of her mouth trembling as though she might speak. Then she shook her head. "I can't," she whispered. "I don't know what you think you know, but it's not. I mean, there's nothing I can do. He's my boss, and if I step out of line, I lose my job." Her voice cracked on the last few words, and Dwayne's heart clenched. "You can," Dwayne told her with quiet conviction. "And you will. We can stop him from doing this to you or to anyone else." She opened her mouth to protest, but at that moment, a shadow fell across them both. Clark had arrived, exuding a palpable aura of annoyance. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his tone polite but laced with threat. Dwayne stood up straighter, but before he could respond, he noticed Sophie's reaction. She seemed to shrink, her fingers twisting the corner of her apron so tightly that her knuckles turned white. That single gesture told him more than words ever could. Clark's cold eyes flicked from Sophie to Dwayne, clearly sizing up the situation. "Sophie has a job to do," he said. "She doesn't have time for private chats with customers." His voice held a note of warning, and he emphasized the words private chats as though hinting at impropriety. Sophie shifted uncomfortably under his gaze, and in that moment, Dwayne decided he could no longer hold back. He'd seen enough. The important pieces of the puzzle were all in front of him now. A manager who exercised manipulative, coercive control over a vulnerable employee, co-workers who confirmed the pattern, and a sobbing conversation that left no doubt about the psychological torment Sophie was enduring. Dwayne squared his shoulders, meeting Clark's stare without flinching. "Actually," he began, his voice steady and calm, "I think you and I need to have a conversation right now." Clark's condescending smirk wavered slightly. "Excuse me?" he asked, the veneer of politeness beginning to crack. Reaching into his pocket, Dwayne produced a small leather wallet containing his executive credentials for Verano's parent company. In a single, deliberate motion, he flipped it open, revealing the official ID that made it unmistakable that he was more than just an ordinary diner. Sophie let out a soft gasp, and a hush seemed to ripple through the few employees within earshot. Some of the remaining patrons glanced over, sensing that a confrontation of considerable weight was unfolding. "My name is Dwayne Johnson," he declared, his gaze fixed on Clark. "I'm the owner of Verano, and you and I need to talk in your office right now." Clark's face went pale, his features momentarily frozen in shock. He glanced around, perhaps desperate for a way to salvage the situation or an explanation that could minimize the damage. But there was none. Sophie stood just behind Dwayne, her trembling hands pressed together, while Andrew and Jacob hovered nearby, their eyes wide with astonishment. The customers who noticed the exchange went silent, likely picking up on the tension, but unsure of what it truly meant. Finally, Clark seemed to gather himself enough to stammer a response. "Sir, I didn't realize you were here tonight," he managed, attempting to force a grin. "Of course, I'll take you to my office. I'm sure there's some misunderstanding we can clear up." Dwayne gave Sophie one final reassuring nod. "Stay here," he told her gently. "I won't be long." Clark led him through the dining area and down a corridor that ended at a cramped yet neatly maintained office. The name Donovan Clark, manager, was stenciled on the door in professional lettering, lending an air of respectability that now felt hollow. Once inside, Clark tried to regain composure, hastily straightening a few file folders on his desk. "I have to say, Mr. Johnson," he began, "this is quite the surprise. We weren't expecting—" Dwayne cut him off by leaning forward, planting his hands on the desk so that he and Clark were almost at eye level. "You know what else is surprising?" he asked quietly, though a dangerous edge underscored each word. "A manager who thinks he can use his position of power to intimidate and manipulate his staff." Clark's mouth opened, but no immediate denial emerged. He swallowed hard, his carefully maintained facade wavering. "I'm not sure what you've heard. It's or serene," he finally ventured. "But there seems to be a misunderstanding. I've always conducted myself professionally." Dwayne eyed him with unmistakable disapproval. "Let's not play games," he warned, his tone turning sharper. "I know about the late shifts you forced Sophie to take, alone. I know about the subtle threats and the power plays. You've made employees believe that if they so much as question you, they'll lose their jobs." Clark's eyes darted to the side, searching for any kind of distraction or hole to crawl through. Unable to find one, he tried to muster a defense. "Sophie's misreading my intentions," he said, clearing his throat. "She's a bit emotional, and I've been trying to guide her." Dwayne snorted, a harsh sound of disbelief. "Emotional? I heard her crying in the break room tonight. She wasn't crying because of a challenging shift. She was crying out of sheer terror." Reaching into his jacket pocket, Dwayne retrieved his phone. With a tap, he played back a brief audio recording he had managed to catch earlier. The muffled voices were partially obscured by background noise, but Sophie's soft sobs were unmistakable, along with Andrew's urgent whisper, "You can't let him do this to you. He doesn't own you." Dwayne paused the recording, allowing the silence in the office to thicken. Clark's face drained of color, and sweat beaded at his temples. "You should have been more careful," Dwayne said, voice cold. "It's not 1980. Technology is everywhere, and people you've hurt are willing to speak up if they believe someone in power will actually listen." Clark's composure fractured. His breathing became shallow, and his shoulders slumped as he realized the gravity of his predicament. "Please," he finally muttered, desperation seeping into his tone. I can explain everything if you just—" "No," Dwayne interrupted, pushing away from the desk. "You don't get to twist this. I've heard enough. And once I speak with human resources and legal, you'll never work in this industry again." Clark's eyes bulged slightly. "Mr. Johnson, let's be reasonable," he pleaded, perhaps clinging to the hope that the situation could be salvaged. "I've devoted a lot of time to Verano, and in return, you preyed on employees who needed a paycheck to survive." Dwayne shot back, stepping toward the door. "Consider your time at Verano finished." With that, he turned the handle and stepped back into the hallway, leaving Clark to stare after him, powerless. The confrontation hadn't taken long, but every moment had felt charged with tension. As Dwayne exited the office, he inhaled deeply, as if trying to clear away the stench of Clark's manipulative reign. At the far end of the corridor, Sophie stood with Andrew, Jacob, and a few other staff members who had gathered in anxious anticipation. The sight of their worried faces reminded Dwayne that this was only the beginning. He might have removed Clark from his position, but the harm done in the environment that allowed it to happen still needed to be addressed. When Dwayne returned to the main dining area, he felt every eye in the restaurant upon him. Although it was late and only a few tables were still occupied, the tension hung thick in the air, making the space feel far from empty. Sophie's eyes widened when she spotted him, and Andrew and Jacob both straightened, as if bracing for significant news. Dwayne came to a stop in front of them, his expression calm but resolute. "Donovan Clark is gone," he announced softly, but clearly enough that everyone nearby could hear. "He won't be bothering you again." For a few seconds, no one reacted. It was as if the staff collectively held their breath, uncertain if Clark might burst back in or if this was all an elaborate ruse. Then Sophie let out a trembling exhale. Her shoulders sagged in visible relief, and tears welled in her eyes for the second time that night. Though this time they seemed to be tears of release rather than fear. Andrew and Jacob exchanged stunned glances. They had hoped for a resolution, but perhaps not so swiftly or decisively. Dwayne could see a mix of emotions crossing the faces of other employees, from cautious optimism to raw disbelief. He raised his voice slightly to address everyone. "I realize this might feel sudden," he began, "but I've seen and heard enough tonight to know Clark was unfit for his position. Some of you have probably suspected this for a while, maybe even experienced it directly. I want you to know this kind of behavior won't be tolerated. Not here. Not in any part of Verano's operations." His gaze flicked to Sophie, whose cheeks were streaked with drying tears. "From now on, I'm personally reviewing how this restaurant is run," he continued. "We'll be doing an internal audit of management practices, scheduling, and staff treatment. Changes will be made, and if any of you feel unsafe or disrespected, I promise, I'm listening." Sophie wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Her voice shook as she asked, What happens next?" Dwayne gave her a gentle smile. "We fix what's broken," he replied. "But it's not just about hiring a new manager. It's about rebuilding trust here, making sure no one else can use fear to get what they want. I'll need your help, all of you." Andrew, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "Look, Mr. Johnson, Clark was just one problem. The way things run here, it's bigger than him. Most of us have worried about speaking out, because once you do, it's easy to end up on the chopping block. We've all got bills to pay." Several staff members nodded in agreement, the weight of their collective fear still tangible. Dwayne nodded back, acknowledging the harsh reality. "I know. That's why this can't just be about firing Clark. It has to be about creating an environment where you can voice concerns safely, where you're not terrified of retaliation." The gravity in the room began to lift just enough for employees to whisper among themselves, openly for the first time in a long while. Sophie looked around, seemingly stunned to see so many of her coworkers, Andrew, Jacob, and others, united in this moment. A flicker of hope replaced the terror in her eyes. "I just never thought anyone would listen," she admitted, her voice a soft tremor. "I was convinced he'd find a way to fire me if I said anything. I needed this job too badly." Dwayne nodded, his own voice gentle. "I get it. That's how people like Clark operate. They thrive on making you feel there's no escape." He glanced around, addressing the group at large. "But what I saw and heard tonight proves that you aren't alone. You've got each other, and now you've got me." Andrew spoke again, more confident this time. "Are we safe now?" he asked, though his tone indicated lingering uncertainty. Dwayne offered a firm nod. "Clark is out, and I'll make sure HR and legal have everything they need to keep him from trying to retaliate in any form. If he attempts to contact or pressure any of you, I want to hear about it immediately." Jacob exhaled, relief washing over his features. "Thank you," he said earnestly. "I know it's just the start, but it feels like a huge weight has been lifted off all our shoulders." Dwayne nodded again, glancing around at the small circle of employees who had gathered, some with tears in their eyes, others with hopeful smiles. In his heart, he felt a complex mix of sadness and determination. Sadness that Verano, his pride and joy, had become a place of intimidation for some, and determination to ensure that such abuse would never find root here again. Over the next hour, the staff closed down the restaurant with an energy that felt markedly different from the oppressive tension that had reigned earlier. Sophie, Andrew, Jacob, and a few others worked with quiet focus, but the anxious glances over their shoulders had subsided. Dwayne joined them not as the distant owner, but as a hands-on supporter, picking up menus, wiping down counters, and making sure everyone felt comfortable discussing their concerns. Some employees were still wary, not quite ready to trust the shift in authority. But others opened up, sharing stories of subtle threats or intimidation from Clark. The more they talked, the clearer it became that Clark's toxic influence had permeated the work culture for months, if not longer. Finally, as the last of the lights were turned off and the doors locked, Dwayne lingered in the parking lot, watching Sophie, Andrew, and Jacob walk out together. Their postures were more relaxed, as if a storm cloud had lifted. Yet Dwayne's mind churned, already planning the steps he would have to take in the coming days, arranging for a thorough HR intervention, likely bringing in new management who would share his vision of respect and safety, and keeping lines of communication open so no one felt powerless again. He slid into the driver's seat of his car, feeling both drained and resolute. Clark might be gone, but Dwayne couldn't shake the thought. How many more restaurants were out there, with managers just like him, banking on silence and fear to maintain their positions of power? Being a leader, he reminded himself, wasn't merely about profit margins or a menu success. It was about responsibility, about making sure the people who worked under his brand felt protected and heard. As he started the engine, he carried with him a renewed sense of purpose. The night had been a harsh lesson, but also a reminder that real leadership starts with empathy and ends with action.